Please be seated. A couple of weeks ago, as we began our journey through this longer season of Advent, we heard Joshua commanding the people to serve God in sincerity and faithfulness. And the people said, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua said, really? I'm not so sure, because you haven't done so great up until now. Are you really going to serve God? And they said, oh yes, we will. The Lord our God we will serve and obey. Remember that? Well, ever since then, I have been pondering, what does it mean, really, to serve God, to obey God? We often pray, and in fact, we just sang, your kingdom come, your will be done. But do we really know what it is that we're asking for there and what we're committing to? What does it mean to do God's will? Well, today Matthew gives us a few very concrete examples of what serving God looks like. And we're all familiar with these, right? Feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, welcoming the stranger, caring for the sick, visiting prisoners. Those should all be pretty obvious, right? They are the core teachings of all major religions, and they are very good things and very much what we are called to do. In fact, much of the outreach of this parish and most other religious organizations is devoted to doing the type of work that Matthew outlines. But there's a danger in this, I think. Because this list is so clear and so concrete, these activities, as faithful as they are, can sometimes become the only way that we can imagine doing God's will. And honestly, the emphasis that this passage is given in churches and sermons, compounded by the sheer brokenness and dysfunction of so many of our communal support systems, means that all of this can combine to make you feel that if I am not actively and directly doing something on this list, then I'm not really doing God's will. I'm not really doing ministry. I think this has two issues. On the one hand, this over-focus on specific actions has actually led to a great deal of toxic charity, focusing on short-term fixes while ignoring the actual input or the capacities of the people who are the focus of the charity, while also doing little or nothing to address the underlying issues. This often then results in reinforcing racist or classist assumptions and very many negative stereotypes of us and others that keeps people in these relationships with disturbingly unequal power dynamics. Feeding a hungry person is great. Working to end the food apartheid system might be even better, but it's a lot harder, right? Because it requires an openness to listening to and working alongside of and being in relationship with people we are not used to listening to or working alongside of or being in relationship with. It's also not on Matthew's list. We hear echoes of this in that famous quote by Dom Helder Camara, the former bishop of Brazil, who said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist." Now, if you're interested in joining an ongoing conversation about how we here at All Saints are engaging these questions, particularly around hunger, I would encourage you to sign up for the Advent series Manna, Bread, and Action, Reflections on Faith and Hunger, which starts next Monday. So toxic charity is one drawback to an overemphasis on Matthew's list. The other is a phenomenon that I have encountered many times over the years in ordained ministry, which is coming into contact with people who are doing amazing things and yet remain deeply troubled by a belief that they are somehow not doing God's will or not doing ministry. People who have counseled clients in domestic violence shelters, or who have provided administrative support to schools for neurodiverse people, or people who have taught and mentored countless students how to think critically and ethically, all of whom have said to me some version of, I don't really have a ministry, or I'm just doing my job, not God's will. It's not like I'm feeding the hungry. And I always want to say to them, but what about just making dinner for people in your house? I mean, we all get hungry every day. And if someone makes you a meal or buys you lunch, aren't they feeding the hungry? See, this over-focus on Matthew's list, as good as it is, can also blind us to an awful lot of ministry that happens every day. What about, for example, the phenomenal and long-term commitment of raising whole, compassionate, and creative children? What about the simple and moving act of texting a friend and sharing a photo of something beautiful, or snuggling closer to your partner on the couch? Some small thing that just makes you and just one other person feel a little less lonely in the world. What about the grace of listening to an elderly person tell a story? Now, maybe it's one you've heard a million times, but hearing it and realizing that this may be the last time you ever hear it, and holding that story with grace and appreciating how important those connections are. What about intentionally reading a book or watching a movie or a TV show with a point of view very different from your own, and feeling a sense of gratitude for how much you don't know and are still capable of learning? What about hosting gatherings where people can learn and discuss and begin working together to create something meaningful and sustaining in the community? Aren't all of those things also doing God's will? Aren't we serving and obeying God when we do those things as well? See, I believe that they are. And my wondering about this question actually sent me back to Thomas Merton, where I found some support for my belief in this. Merton offers his usual indelible clarity around this. In answering the question, what is God's will, he says, quote, God's will is found in anything that is required of us in order that we may be united with one another in love. Let me repeat that. God's will is found in anything that is required of us in order that we may be united with one another in love. And he expands on this by saying that God's will is everything that is demanded of me in order that I may treat every other person effectively as a human being. And to do this, he says, I must learn to share with others their joys, their sufferings, their ideas, their needs, their desires, and I must learn to do this not only in the cases of those who are of the same class, the same profession, the same race, the same nation as myself, but also when those who suffer belong to other groups, even to groups that are regarded as hostile. If I do this, he says, I obey God. If I refuse to do it, I disobey God. Unquote. Okay, a side comment on the word obey, because I know that's a problem for a lot of people. It always helps me to remember that the word obey, although it has come to mean submitting to or being ruled by or just doing what you're told, the root meaning of the word obey is literally and very simply to listen to or to perceive. Obey actually shares the same root as the word audible, which is right, because to truly do the will of God, to figure out how to truly serve God, the first thing that we really need to do is learn how to listen. How to listen to each other, which is how we learn other people's joys and sufferings and ideas and needs and desires. But it's also learning how to listen to and hear God, who does speak through all things and is always trying to get our attention. So in this season of giving and gratitude, by all means, keep doing all of those Matthew 25 things. But let's also continue to develop practices of listening and expanding what our sense of ministry is or could be, so that we are consistently doing those things that are required of us, so that we are treating every other person not as sheep or goats, but as the whole creative, ineffable human being that God has created them to be. Amen.